Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. I'm Ellie Kemmeter with Foley and Lardner, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's NDI Checkpoint web conference. In this program, we address the 2015 proxy season wrap-up. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our program speakers for today. First, we have Josh Agin. Josh is a senior counsel with Foley and Lardner and focuses his practice on assisting public and private companies in the areas of executive compensation, employee benefits, corporate transactions, and securities law compliance. Second, we have Rick Grubow. Rick is a senior vice president of D.F. King. Rick primarily advises corporations and shareholders involved in complex shareholder transactions, specializing in corporate control situations, such as proxy contests, mergers, and unsolicited tender offers. Next, we have Jason Hilley. Jason is a senior counsel with Foley and Lardner. He regularly represents public and private companies in a variety of industries, including mergers and acquisitions, securities law compliance, corporate financings, and general corporate matters. Last, we have Pat McGurn. Pat serves as special counsel at Institutional Shareholder Services, the world's leading provider of proxy voting services and corporate governance research. ISS recommends votes on ballot issues for more than 39,000 shareholder meetings across 100 markets around the globe. Before I turn the presentation over to our speakers, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's program will last approximately 1 hour, followed by a short question and answer session. We encourage you to submit written questions during the program. Please type your question into the Q&A widget open on the left-hand side of your screen. We will respond to written questions at the end of the program, time permitting. The webcast console you are looking at can be completely customized. You can resize or move any of the windows that you have open, including maximizing the PowerPoint presentation on your screen. If you experience technical difficulties during the program, please visit the webcast help guide by clicking the help widget below the presentation window, which is designated with a question mark icon. The PowerPoint presentation will be available on our website at foley.com in the next few days, or you can get a copy of the slides in the resource list widget. As a reminder, today's program is being recorded and will also be available on Foley's website in the next few days. Foley will apply for CLE credit after the web conference. If you did not supply your CLE information upon registration, please send an email to Ellie Kemmeter at ekemmeter@foley.com. To be eligible for CLE, you will need to log into the On24 session and answer a polling question during the program. As a final note, those seeking Kansas, New York, and New Jersey CLE credit are required to complete the attorney affirmation form in addition to the polling question that will appear during the program. A 5-digit code will be announced during the presentation. Please email the form and the code to Ellie Kemmeter at ekemmeter@foley.com immediately following the program. And now I would like to turn the presentation over to Josh Agin.
Thanks, Ellie, and welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webcast. The first thing I wanted to do is just give a quick overview of the topics that we're going to cover today. One of them is going to be shareholder activism developments in 2015, although we're focusing more on the voting results and trends in terms of shareholder proposals and proxy access developments. We wanted to spend a couple minutes at the beginning talking about activism since this was an eventful year in that respect. And then the last thing we're going to do is talk or give a brief update on some of the recent SEC rulemaking and kind of the status of the various Dodd-Frank rulemaking. So first, let's just talk a little bit about some of the shareholder activism developments in 2015. There were continued high levels of activity, similar to the last couple of years. Settlements, including settlements involving board seats, were up, but the support levels for activist candidates when it actually came to a vote in proxy fights was down. We continue to see that larger companies are subject to hedge fund activism. DuPont is probably the most notable example in 2015. That their market cap was, I think, close to $70 billion, and they had a very high-profile activism campaign. And then partnerships among hedge funds and institutional investors continued. And that's a trend that we've seen over the last few years, working together to campaign at some of the larger companies. Perhaps the most high-profile and even dramatic activist campaign in 2015 was at DuPont, where Nelson Peltz's slate of directors lost to management after a very heated campaign. I guess maybe I'd start off by asking Rick, what do you think the kind of key takeaways were from the DuPont fight?
All right, thanks. Well, hopefully that may be the sign of the pendulum finally swinging back to some level of normalcy. Obviously, as you know, DuPont was successful in their campaign. It shows the importance of the retail vote. DuPont had a higher level of retail shareholders than many large cap companies. But it also shows that several of the larger index funds decided to support the company in the proxy contest. DuPont did not have terrible performance, and it just did not raise, the campaign did not raise to the level for the larger indexes to support, and that enabled DuPont to squeak on by.
And Pat, I guess, what's your take on DuPont, and particularly, do you think it's going to affect the way that boards react to activism in future years?
Well, that's an open question right now. For the last couple of years, the dissidents were really sort of winning the bulk of the fight for the last couple of seasons. That is 13 and 14. What I call their battling average. If when fights went to definitive form, either by settlement or at the ballot box, they were winning around 70% of the time for 2 straight years. And that battling average so far this year has dropped down below 50% to 44, I think, and it's probably most compelling in the largest space as well, the over $1 billion category, where it's sort of 1 seat at 3 settled at 1 and lost 8, I think. And so it does indicate that dissidents seem to be having a little tougher time getting board seats, either by last-minute settlements or by outright victories at the ballot box. The issue Rick brought up is one we're hearing about right now. It's not the retail holders that we're hearing about a lot. It's more this active versus passive schism that may be opening up. I think that a lot of differentiations in voting are becoming apparent, where you're a portfolio manager uses a passive indexing strategy, or you're an actively managed manager who tends to sell in and out of securities more often. And so that's a space to watch, because I think traditionally we've looked at this as sort of activists versus plain vanilla investors, and that doesn't seem to, or retail versus institutional, and those don't seem to be as compelling explanatory factors in looking at the results in these fights. But we'll take a look in the future and see how they go. And I think Rick's correct. It's, will this, I guess I'd phrase it a little differently, stiffen the backbone of some boards and not have them settle out as early as they did this year, perhaps, because we saw basically all of Icahn and Dan Loeb's and Bill Ackman's fights, and most of Paul Singer's sort of taken off the board via settlements before they even reached the filing stage for formal proxy materials at the SEC. So we'll have to see how those things fare in the run-up to 2016.
Thanks. I think the next kind of topic or category we want to move on to is talking about the top 10 shareholder proposals in 2015. We'll focus on the top 10, obviously, as they're shown on this slide here. Definitely the number 1 proposal and the most talked about proposal for 2015 was Proxy Access. And Jason's going to remind us of how we got to that point with Proxy Access.
Sure, thanks, Josh. Just a little bit of background. Proxy Access is really a topic that picked up momentum in this last proxy season that's just recently completed or almost completed. I think this is something where those public companies that were bystanders as part of this process this year definitely need to keep their eye on this going forward. As Josh indicated, depending on how you look at it, it was the number 1 proxy proposal. Around 100 proposals were lobbed in. A little bit of background on Proxy Access itself. It refers to the ability of shareholders to be able to get their director nominees directly into the company's proxy statement and on the company proxy card without having to run a separate process. A little bit of additional background, the SEC adopted a universal proxy access rule as part of the Dodd-Frank rulemaking in 2010. That rule was set up such that if a shareholder or group of shareholders held 3% or more of a company's stock for at least 3 years, that shareholder or group of shareholders would have the right to be able to nominate up to 25% of that particular company's board with direct proxy access. Shortly after the rule was put into place, the Business Roundtable and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce challenged the rule, and it was shortly thereafter invalidated by the D.C. Circuit Court in 2011. D.C. Circuit Court indicated in part that the rule had been put in place in an arbitrary and capricious manner, and that the SEC had failed to adequately assess the economic impact of the rule. So rule was put into place, quickly knocked out, and then for a couple of years it kind of went away. As we'll see in a couple of minutes, 2013, 2014 were a little bit quiet on that front. And then in 2015, this last year, there was sort of an explosion of these proposals coming out, with 75 out of the approximately 100 proposals coming out of the New York City Comptroller on behalf of New York City pension funds. The lucky winners of the sweepstakes who received the proposal were selected based allegedly on excessive CEO compensation, lack of board diversity, and a lack of responsiveness to climate change. That was up from 17 proxy access proposals in 2014, so really an explosion. The model that the NYSE Comptroller put forward was the 3%, 3-year, 25% of the board model, very patterned after the rule that had been put in place by the SEC and then knocked out. So this proposal gets shot out to 100 or so companies. Some companies sought to exclude the proposal. Kind of a common way to get a shareholder proposal knocked out is to put a conflicting management proposal out there and then ask the SEC to give a no-action letter that, well, if management's putting a proposal out, we can leave the shareholder's proposal out of the proxy statement. One of the entities looking to get relief on that basis was Whole Foods. Whole Foods, kind of through the common process, was able to obtain a no-action letter in December 2014. Whole Foods was able to get a conflicting proposal put together that was a little bit more restrictive than what the proponent had asked for. It was a 9%, 5-year, and 1 director setup. They received the no-action letter, and there was a ton of investor outcry over this. The proponent lobbed in a complaint. The chair of the SEC, Mary Jo White, asked the staff to reevaluate its decision. In a fashion similar to what I do when my boss asks me to reevaluate a decision, I come to the opposite conclusion after reevaluation. The no-action letter was pulled. And at that point, if you can't get a no-action letter from the SEC, you're kind of left with 2 possibilities. You can go ahead and omit the proposal and risk litigation, or you can include the proponent's proposal and your proposal in the proxy statement. So that's kind of where the world was left with respect to proxy access starting in January of this year. I guess the next question is, what do you do looking forward if you think you're going to be the subject of one of these proposals, or if you think it's at least possible? Do you act preemptively? Do you wait for a shareholder proposal to come in and then react through shareholder engagement after the fact? Another option is to sort of preemptively adopt a proxy access bylaw. Vanguard recently had announced that they would be in favor of a 5% 3-year, 5% of the shares for 3 years, and then be able to nominate 20% of the board, so a little bit more restrictive than what the NYSE Comptroller put forward last year. You could promise to adopt a proxy access in the future. I guess one question that I would ask, and I would ask public companies to think about and ask it to maybe Pat and Rick, is to what extent, when you're trying to make a decision here, you kind of look at your particular situation and your particular risk. If you do implement a proxy access bylaw, what do? Do you look at kind of your shareholder base? Do we think activists are going to take advantage of this? If your shareholder base, for instance, if you're looking at a Carl Icahn type situation, care if you have proxy access where they may run their own process? Do you care if your largest shareholders are otherwise institutional investors? If you look at your shareholder census, so to speak, and try to decide whether to act preemptively, what do you do? What do you look at?
Well, if you want me, this is Rick, I'll start. First, I will agree that this is an explosion, a wave that doesn't show any sign of stopping. The shareholders have spoken this year. Although this proposal was all but on the back burner a year ago, it is full force this year, and almost every one of the major institutions has been supportive of the proposal as it's written, the 3%, 3 years, other than Vanguard, who was willing to vote against it if management adopted it 5%. Unfortunately, Vanguard is not large enough to counter all of your shareholders. So companies are faced with, if they do receive a proxy access proposal based on their shareholder base, they may lose that vote, and then they will be forced to ultimately adopt it or to pay the price of not adopting a shareholder proposal. So companies can preempt and adopt their own their own proxy access proposal with some more rigidness to it. Really, most of the rigidness that companies can embrace is lowering the percentage of the board from the 25 to 3 and limiting the number of shareholders. The proposal as it's written does not limit the number of shareholder proposals or shareholders that can accumulate to make up the 3%. So several companies have implemented bylaws that restrict it to 10 or 20. Pat, anything else to add?
Yeah, I guess the first step is, I think, to go out and engage, not just hire somebody to look at the policies of these investors and say how they're likely to vote, but actually go out and touch base with them. I think boards can get themselves into hot water pretty quick when they take unilateral action if it doesn't appear that they've gone out and vetted the issue with institutional investors in advance. And I think investors on this issue, want to communicate quite often, especially if the company wants to make an argument for changing some of the variables that Rick was just talking about. I think there is limited latitude on the percentage of ownership, virtually zero latitude on the holding period. A slight bit of latitude on the number of seats on the board that can be sought under an access rule. And there is some tolerance from the votes we've seen this year for limiting the number of shareholders who can aggregate their shares to put it together to hit the access threshold. I think although it's got to be a meaningful number, it can't be one shareholder, for example. That's just not going to fly. But I think if a company is going to tweak one or more of those variables, they'd be very well served to go out and communicate in advance before they just go ahead and file an 8K announcing they put a new bylaw in place.
And I think moving to the next slide really illustrates kind of the jump in the proposals that we've seen here. It also shows the jump in support. We went from a position of having just a couple of proposals out there that were receiving in the 30s and even under the 30s in support to a much larger number of proposals hanging out there with around 55% support. And my understanding, without having gone back through all of the losing proposals, so to speak, even those items, even those proposals where you were looking at the 3%, 3 years for 25% of the board, you were looking at 40% support even in those cases, not kind of the losing vote at 20% or 15% like you see with some shareholder proposals.
Right. The institutions were pretty much formulated sort of their position on this prior to proxy season. So there was not a lot of give and take from the institutions on their position on this. And obviously it is reflected in the voting totals.
It was definitely strong support, and to your point, we've sort of seen the retail variation that was much more, I guess, flexible in allowing small shareholders to aggregate their positions together to meet some separate access standard. Those have disappeared from the scene. I think all the shareholder proposals bar one, and there's been 89 on ballots to date this year, have been the 3-3-25 formulation. Now, some of the management proposals that have shown up on ballots, have sought to kind of change a couple of those variables, typically the first one to 5% from 3%. And a couple of them managed to pass muster with shareholders, even though there were 3-3-25 shareholder proposals on the ballot at the same time. So obviously, if you've got the right shareholder base, and you've done your communications up front, it could be the case you get support. But I think I agree with Rick. A lot of them have set some of these variables in stone, at least for the first year. I think, and I think they're looking for a strong explanation from an issuer, from a board of that issuer. I think if the company wants to sort of go off the grid at that point.
Right. What this slide shows is the board-sponsored proposals, which if the SEC did not refuse to address the conflicting proposal, this chart probably would have shown a lot more management proposals that would have attempted to have a conflicting proposal, and most likely we would have seen several companies going in with a 5% 3-year management proposal to create the conflicting proposal. And it would have been interesting, this would have played out over years to see whether or not there was sort of a middle ground somewhat higher than the 3% 3 years. But due to the SEC's position, we will never know kind of how that played out.
And Pat, my understanding, the latest and greatest from Mary Jo White at the SEC, or even the SEC in general, is that obviously no answer on what we're going to hear from kind of the Whole Foods situation with not granting no action letters for the management conflicting proposal, maybe even leaning towards status quo going into next year's proxy season, where we may or may not see a decision, and the decision maybe is leaning toward continuing to not grant no action letters on that basis. Is that kind of consistent with where you see things as well?
Yeah, I mean, folks that thought that kind of Whole Foods was going to, carry the flag and bring this issue to court and get it decided were, I think, disappointed when they went ahead and adopted a 3-3 access rule just within the last couple of days. I think, and so there doesn't appear to be anybody sort of pursuing the legal challenge to get a court to interpret I-9 instead of the SEC, and so I think it's going to be in the SEC's court. The speech that Mary Jo White, the chair of the SEC, gave at the corporate secretaries meeting recently seemed to indicate that she had, some comfort levels with how the issues played out with respect to shareholder and management proposals being on the ballot at the same time on Proxy Access this year. She quoted the numbers that everybody has, which are kind of 3 management proposal 1, 3 shareholder proposals 1, and there was 1 draw, although the shareholder resolution at that firm got more support. And so it appears, I think, from the results that we've seen and the way the SEC is interpreting those results, that investors were not confused about having competing proposals on the ballot, and that may indicate that they're leaning in that direction of sort of keeping the moratorium on granting those I-9 requests in place, or just making that a permanent part of their interpretation of the rule, as opposed to returning to the previous status quo. But they really haven't tipped their hand completely. I'm speaking at the SEC's Investor Advisory Committee meeting tomorrow here in D.C., and I do think it's on a webcast if people want to listen in, because that panel is going to, one of the issues they're going to be talking about is I-9 and what sort of recommendation they want to give to the Commission from their perspective.
So I think I will let Rick and Pat pick it up. Moving on to the other shareholder proposals, it sounds like Proxy Access is a little bit of a wait-and-see situation, but be prepared, I think, is a good summary of where we are.
Okay, I'll take it from there. The second largest, second most active shareholder proposal is the reporting on political contributions and lobbying payments, which has for a number of years been either the highest or close thereto of the amount of proposals submitted. This is one of the proposals that I would say many of the investors really do have a case-by-case voting position on this. And for a company with an articulate, concise message on sort of the board oversight of the process, many of the investors are willing to vote against this proposal. But obviously the proposal routinely does not pass. However, it does, I will say, require a lot of dialogue with the institutional investors over this proposal, because without sort of that extra level of dialogue, companies are still concerned that it could pass. Pat, anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the ballots, this issue did lose some ground this year. It had been the second and third most popular proposals for the last couple of years, that is political spending and over lobbying disclosure. And this year, if you disaggregate them on the list of proposal count, at least, that hit ballots, they drop all the way down to 5 and 7, with lobbying actually having more this year for the first time than political spending did. Overall support was either flat or slightly down year over year. But the interesting thing is there were 6 majority votes on these two topics last year, and so far this year there's been 0. I think, and part of what that indicates is a lot of boards, I think, if they think they're in trouble on this issue, are actually settling with the proponents for making some additional disclosures and getting the proposals withdrawn. So it could be that this is one of those topics that's starts to move off proxy at this point in time, because it has gotten critical mass at some companies, I think, as far as the voting support goes, and boards would rather, I guess, be responsive than have this play out at their annual meeting.
We are entering a political year, so hold tight for next year. Okay, the next proposal is the independent board chair proposal, which obviously gets the most attention in the corner office. This is a proposal, and I'll let Pat talk about. ISS had changed their policy for this year, but this is a proposal that has gotten a significant level of support. There are several institutional investors that just believe that this is the proper policy to separate the chair, and so those institutions are very rigid and very hard to get them to change off of that policy. So this proposal, depending on your shareholder base, it can either get a relatively low vote or dangerously close to passing. So, and Pat, if you want to chat about the change in policy this year?
Yeah, I mean, we did end up supporting more of these resolutions this season, but it didn't make a dent in voting support. In fact, average support actually dropped by 2 full percentage points from 31.1 last year to 29.1 this year in 2015. And the number of majority votes on the topic was halved, at least so far, from 4 in 2014 to 2 this year. And so I don't think, frankly, hearts and minds are changing on this issue. People seem to have a fairly well-established processes for looking at these proposals, I think, and I think the burden quite often is on the proponent. We have seen a shift in the language, and that's part of the reason that our recommendations are changing a little bit. They're not asking for the current CEO chair to be stripped of the chairman's title. They're simply asking for the board to consider making that change at some point in time in the future. I think the proponents are looking perhaps to make these more prospective in hopes of getting more support from some of the asset managers and mutual fund complexes that simply don't support these proposals today.
Okay. The next proposal is the ability for shareholders to act by written consent. One of the main issues that investors say is that there needs to be a mechanism to address, issues outside of the annual meeting process, okay? Whether or not that's a crisis or whether or not it's an M&A event, the shareholders believe they should have the right to be able to replace directors outside of that window of the annual meeting, which, of course, for the annual meeting can be very rigid with a pre-notification bylaw. So this is a proposal that, as you can see, the support has been year over year dropping. One of the reasons for that was early on in the process, investors believed that you should have the ability to both call a special meeting, or the shareholders could act by written consent. After a while, some investors have taken the position that as long as the company either has the ability to call a special meeting or to act by written consent, one of them is sufficient. And many investors actually prefer the ability to call a special meeting. So many companies who are faced with a written consent proposal, if they do not have the ability to call a special meeting, one of the strategies there would be to embrace and have a shareholder proposal or have a management proposal to allow shareholders to call a special meeting. Pat, anything?
Yeah, I'll just chime in real quickly. I agree that most of our clients seem to favor, if you're looking at action between meetings, special meetings to written consent solicitations. I think one of the reasons why you see so many of these proposals is that companies were using the I-9 grounds for exclusion to get the special meeting proposals off their ballots over the last couple of years. And so the proponents who are going and sticking those special meeting resolutions on ballots started putting the written consent proposals in instead. So this year, I guess, was the perfect storm because the special meeting proposals made it on as well. And so I think it gained up about a percentage point in average support overall to just about 40% when it shows up on ballots. So one difference this year, there were 2 majority votes on the topic, and there have been 0 last year. So it could be an issue that's getting a little bit of momentum, but I do agree with Rick that there's a lot of investors out there that if the company has a meaningful right to call a special meeting, they'll probably view that as being sufficient and may end up opposing the written consent right proposal as a result.
Okay, next is pro-rata vesting of equity awards. Luckily, this is a proposal that does not get tremendous traction. There are shareholders that believe that it is that there should be pro-rata vesting, but there's sufficient numbers of the larger investors just believe that it's just not necessary, and it's not really a significant problem. So it is not something that they embrace. So it has been, although we still see several of these proposals, it is not getting any real traction.
Well, I don't know if I'd agree with that completely. Last year was the breakout year for this issue. There were 4 majority votes back in 2014, and support jumped as well. It did come back down to earth a little bit in terms of average voting support, dropped about 2 percentage points from last year, but still remains in the mid-30s, and there have been at least 2 majority votes so far this year. So it's something that's on investors' radar screens. Notably, this is one of those issues that was impacted by engagement as well. I think there were some companies who were hoping to use I-9 to exclude these proposals from their ballots based upon the fact they actually had an equity plan on the ballot, which was going to address sort of the pro-rata vesting double trigger issue. I think, and when that got scuttled, I think it did send some of the companies scurrying to try and reach some sort of negotiated settlement with the proponents in order to get the resolutions off the ballot. But it's one to watch. Of all the comp-related proposals beyond clawbacks, which will probably disappear with the new SEC regulation, it seemed to be the one that got the most traction this year.
Okay, the next few proposals are some of the social proposals. First one is greenhouse gases, adopt qualitative GHG goals or report on GHG emission reduction targets. These are proposals that, obviously we're seeing an increase in the number of these proposals. They are not, the average support is certainly below average, but they certainly do require a significant amount of engagement with the institutional investors on these topics. Although the voting results show that they're not gaining a lot of support, many of the investors do want to talk to the issuers regarding these proposals and their procedures. Pat, anything?
Just a couple points. Some of the proponents got a little fancy this year. I think they looked to take the climate risk campaign, which had started last year, and really sort of tie it to more sort of front office investor operations by trying to link climate risk to issues like CapEx spending by companies on energy exploration and on linking greenhouse gas emission standards to executive compensation. And some of those new hybrid proposals, even though I think they were intriguing to investors, didn't end up getting much support. In particular, the ones looking to make greenhouse gas emissions a comp standard average to only 6.2%. There are about, I guess there are 5 of them that showed up on ballots. So we'll have to see how the proponents sort of reconfigure their programs or if they change any of those, because they had, I think, gotten significant traction in some of the votes on just some pure proposals before. And if you look at sustainability proposals too, they actually went and continued to receive higher support at the 30% level on average. And a lot of those sustainability report resolutions, which just call for reporting on future risks, did draw in the greenhouse gas emission issue. So it could be we'll see a shift back, a shift down in the ask in some of these proposals going forward.
The next is anti-discrimination EEO proposals. What's interesting with this shareholder proposal is there were 35 of them submitted and only 5 went to a vote. So it clearly shows that engagement and or no action relief was critical in discussing these issues up front. Many of these proposals were withdrawn. The ones that went, was not that, it was to prepare an employment diversity report was the major one. Obviously, support was not substantial. I don't know whether there was an incredible risk, but there was, it still requires for those that went to a vote a large level of engagement just to satisfy the institutional investors.
Yeah, I think this is one of those issues that's largely gone off proxy now and probably will continue to and eventually it'll leave the list of top shareholder resolutions simply because I think companies are looking to engage with the proponents quite often because these can be sensitive issues not only in the public marketplace and in the media but with their own employee bases as well. And so I think you will continue to see issues like this and looping in other things like board diversity ending up getting settled more often than they actually are voted.
Right. I would even add to that many companies did not even really address the issue internally until they either received a letter. Many companies first receive a letter on this issue, and it enables them to sort of spend the time working with the proponents to try to come to some level of resolution to avoid it. Next proposal is the report on sustainability. Pat hit it on that this is a much lower bar, just simply to report on sustainability, and then it ties in the greenhouse gases. So it's a lower bar and obviously more a greater vote outcome on it, but still not in the threat level of passing at most companies.
Yeah, this was the topic that produced the only majority vote to date this season on an E&S proposal, so I think it did have a little momentum vis-a-vis some of the others in that regard, but it's one that has, I think, not increased its act significantly until this change to bring the greenhouse gas emissions in this year, and I think it was picking up a lot more traction with mainstream investors, the large asset managers and mutual fund complexes in recent years, especially as they run more E&S funds themselves, I think, and so it is something where the ask is really focused in on disclosure and risk, and I think that's something that most companies are doing voluntarily these days. So again, I would expect, and we did see, in fact, this year a high level of negotiated settlements where companies simply agreed to put in their own reports.
Okay, the next is the ability for shareholders to call a special meeting. We kind of addressed many of the points with the written consent, but as you can see, there's an uptick here as well due to no ability to put up a conflicting proposal. What generally happens with this proposal is the ask, the first proposal, would typically be at 10 or 15%, and management would have the ability to submit a proposal, a management-sponsored proposal at 25%. And several investors are okay with a 25% threshold. And the rationale to that is that, okay, at 10%, it is possible for, the hedge funds to hijack the process and, call special meetings for activism right outside of the annual meeting process, and is that really necessary, versus a 25% threshold in the event of a crisis and or an M&A event where a company receives an unsolicited offer and there's a special meeting called to remove the board. The 25% threshold is not, not so high that an offer to buy a company, the shareholder proponent would be able to get to the 25% threshold most likely in that scenario. So many of the investors are comfortable at that threshold, and so we still see companies receiving this proposal when they have 25% at a lower threshold that are able to defeat it. But as you can see by the voting results, this is a proposal that if you do not have the ability to act by written consent and you don't have the ability to call a special meeting, you could lose this proposal very easily. Pat, anything to add on that?
Yeah, just to emphasize the point on the competing proposals this year, unlike on Access where there was sort of a split 50-50 between management or shareholder proposals winning, here 5 out of the 6 competing management proposals won majority support, and the other one got majority support as well, but it failed because there was 80% of the outstanding supermajority vote requirement. So this is one of those cases where I think a lot of investors will take the bird in hand, even though they were voting on a management proposal calling for 25 or 20% thresholds for demand requirements to call special meetings. They were willing to take that, especially if the company was lowering that or if they required unanimous demand to do it before. I think, and one interesting thing was we started seeing some of the proponents floating their standards upwards. So that the distance between the shareholder proposal ask and the management bylaw provision has decreased. Sometimes we're seeing kind of a 20% demand level from the shareholder proposal and a 25% level coming in the management proposal, so that the gap seems to be narrowing somewhat.
Okay, the next is the clawback incentive payments, which of course is got other issues going on right now. But this was a new proposal in the top 10 this year. Obviously got significant support, but I guess I will pass it back to Jason or Josh to run through the issue of the day.
Sure, yeah. So this is a bit more forward-looking than maybe our normal topics for the wrap-up, but since it is the kind of the latest SEC development, wanted to just cover it briefly here. So the SEC earlier this month proposed rules on compensation recovery policies. This is the last of the Dodd-Frank rulemakings relating to compensation governance. And so the SEC appears to sort of gradually be catching up on this. And so these rules, they would direct national securities exchanges and associations to adopt listing standards that would require listed companies to develop and implement compensation clawback recoveries. So under these proposed rules, listed companies would have to have written clawback policies, and those policies would need to require the recovery of certain incentive-based compensation that's received by current or former executive officers. Under the proposed rules, there would also be some disclosures required in SEC filings if a clawback were triggered. These listing standards would have to apply generally to all issuers that have a listed class of securities. That would include foreign private issuers, controlled companies, smaller reporting companies, and emerging growth companies. And that's in contrast to some of the other Dodd-Frank compensation rules like the CEO pay ratio or the pay for performance disclosures that would have either scaled back disclosure or wouldn't apply to emerging growth companies at all. This one's going to apply very broadly. So the clawback under these proposed rules would have to be triggered by an accounting restatement that's required to correct an error that is material to previously issued financial statements. So there is that materiality element that was also in the statute. The clawback would have to apply to all incentive-based compensation that's received by current or former executive officers during the 3 fiscal years ending before the date on which the issuer is required to prepare the restatement. And that date on which the issuer is required to prepare the accounting restatement is going to be similar to the item 402 of 8K determination, which is when it's basically triggered by the board determining or should it reasonably have determined that a restatement is required. Incentive-based compensation is going to be defined as compensation that's received due to the achievement of a goal based on accounting principles or on stock price or total stockholder return. So, I mean, one interesting aspect of this is that stock options that are tied solely to continued employment, so time vesting options, and other types of equity awards that are solely time-based would not be subject to this policy. And it's interesting in part because Dodd-Frank expressly referenced options in describing the compensation that would be subject to it. So a lot of the speculation before these rules came out was about, how would you calculate the amount of the clawback applicable to options. So the clawback would still apply to performance-based options, but not to options that are solely based on time vesting. Another interesting aspect about this proposed definition of incentive-based compensation is that for companies that use a 162M umbrella plan structure where even for their time-based equity awards, so that you only make the grant of the time vesting equity if you have, first of all, achieved a certain performance goal, and it's usually a very achievable performance goal, and you do that to make sure that all your compensation is deductible, because otherwise 162M of the Internal Revenue Code can limit deductibility. But I guess the point here is that just including that kind of initial performance threshold for purposes of qualifying your awards under this code section could result in awards that would otherwise be exempt from the clawback rules because they're time-based, being instead subject to the clawback rules. The amount of the recovery, the excess of the amount actually received over the amount that would have been received based on the restated numbers, it's determined on a pre-tax basis. So note that's an economic hardship for the executives because they will have probably paid taxes on these awards, and they'll need to repay the gross amount. Where the incentive-based compensation is based on stock price or TSR, then you can use reasonable estimates to calculate the amount of the clawback. This is unlike the Sarbanes-Oxley clawback. No fault or involvement in the preparation of the financial statements is required for an executive to be subject to this. And enforcement is going to be mandatory except in a couple of narrow circumstances where the cost of the enforcement would exceed the likely amount of the recovery, or where the recovery would be illegal under home country law. Lastly, on clawbacks, the proposed rules would prohibit issuers from indemnifying officers for the clawback amounts or from paying for insurance to cover the clawback amounts. The clawback policy would have to be filed as an exhibit to the annual report, and information about the enforcement of the clawback would be required generally in proxy statements for most companies, information about the amount that needs to be clawed back, the kind of balance of clawback amounts that haven't been recovered. Those things would need to be disclosed in the proxy statement or the Form 10K. And I think we have to make a CLE announcement.
Yep, thanks, Josh. So at this time, I'm going to read the CLE code for this program. So if you are in need of CLE credit today, please enter this 5-digit code into the poll question on the screen after it's announced and press the Submit button. The code is 2MEGQ. Again, that's the number 2, the letter M as in Mary, the letter E as in Edward, the letter G as in George, and the letter Q as in Quincy. 2MEGQ. Again, if you are seeking CLE credit for this session, please complete the polling question by entering the code that was just announced. The polling question will remain open briefly. And as a side note, for those seeking Kansas, New York, and New Jersey CLE credit, in addition to the polling question, you need to complete the CLE attorney affirmation form and return it immediately following the program. A copy of the form can be found in the resource list widget.
Thanks, Ellie. So moving on to the last proposal topic for today, management say on pay. Rick, did you want to comment?
Yeah, other than to report that there is not a significant issue to report on say on pay. It's hovering almost identical to last year's results. 2% of the companies have failed say on pay, and the sort of the gray zone is now 7% versus 8% last year, year-over-year numbers. But so it's I think we've found sort of the level that we're going to accept is what is now normal. Obviously the overwhelming majority, we got 91.8%. So that's where we are. Pat, you want anything on that?
Yeah, it was definitely a year when say on pay was out of the spotlight, I think, and I think engagement has a lot to do with that. I think companies and boards have gotten very adept now, especially if they get a low level of support at reaching out to investors and listening to their concerns and either raising their disclosures or making reforms to their program or both. I think just a couple things. From this season of note, more recidivism than we had seen in recent years where companies have multiple failures. We have one company that's a 5-time failure, but we've got a couple, numerous ones now that have failed 2 or 3 times, including 2 years in a row. The other thing is what I call the company that's not looking for a reversal of fortune, so just looking to get above the 50% level. And we've seen some companies with failed votes now probably talking to their investors and doing just enough to inch by and get into, get out of the red zone and get into majority support. And I think that's sort of a prescription for a yo-yo situation in the future where they're just going to bounce back and forth between failure and adoption year over year. So just a couple of trends to look out for there. One other interesting one is I think we've started hearing some buzz about the whole frequency issue, because obviously under Dodd-Frank, this is something that you had to bring back after 6 years, I think, and so we expect a lot of issuers and boards will be thinking about that and bringing it back on the ballot next year. And I think most of what I've heard is most people are going to stick with what they've got, which is 1 year or 3 year typically, I think, but there may be some companies, especially those who've had 5 straight years of 95% plus support, that might be tempted to try and see if shareholders are willing to go along with biennial or triennial. I can tell you from talking with institutional investors that they really haven't engaged in that debate. Most of them have pretty hard and fast rules as to whether they'll support annual or triennial. There are very few biennials out there, I think, and so it's another issue that if you're even thinking about a change in that regard, it's probably a good point just to add to your list of engagement topics when you go out and talk with institutional investors.
Indeed. And I guess for the remainder of the presentation, just want to talk briefly about a couple of proxy disclosure rulemaking items that could become effective as early as next year, at least in theory. The first one is mandatory pay for performance disclosure. So these rules were proposed for comment in April. The comment period has now ended. So these rules would require the disclosure in the proxy statement of the relationship between executive compensation actually paid to the executive officers and the cumulative total shareholder return of the registrant, and the relationship between the registrant's TSR and the TSR of a peer group. Under the proposed rules, the disclosure would consist of 2 components. There would be a table in the format shown on the slide here covering the preceding 5 years or 3 years if you're a smaller reporting company. It would have to be formatted using XBRL. So that would be kind of a new thing for proxy statements to have disclosure that needed to be formatted in XBRL. It's been going on in 10Ks for years now, but that would be an extra kind of logistical piece to manage in the proxy statement. And the idea there is that that format makes it easier for people to compare and research the data that's actually disclosed in that format on the SEC's website. Then in addition to that table, then you would, under these proposed rules, need to include a graph or a narrative or both that provides a clear description of the relationship between the executive compensation actually paid and TSR, and then the relationship between the registrant's TSR and the peer group TSR. The compensation actually paid would be a defined term. It'd be based on the summary compensation table total compensation concept, but there would be a couple of differences. For one, the value of equity awards, which are shown in summary compensation table at their full grant date fair value. Even if they vest over multiple years, you're showing that full accounting value up front in the summary comp table. But in this pay for performance table, the equity awards would be valued at vesting rather than at the time of grant. The other difference would be in the summary compensation table, you show the change in the value of the pension plan benefit. That's the present value of that accrued at the end of the year. So that it takes into account various components that aren't just related to the most recent year. In this pay for performance table, the pension plan value would only be limited to that amount of the change in the pension benefit that's attributable to the year of service that the disclosure relates to. So it should be generally a smaller number. Smaller reporting companies would be permitted to provide scaled disclosure, only 3 years rather than 5, not required to do that pension calculation and not required to present a peer group TSR. Emerging growth companies, foreign private issuers would be exempt under these proposed rules, and there would be a transition period. You'd start with, for people who are subject to the 5 years, you'd start with 3 years, and then you'd add a year for each of the next 2 years. I guess, Pat, I'd be curious if you had any views yet on how this relates to, because ISS, when it does its day on pay evaluation, looks at pay for performance. Do you see any relationship between these rules and what ISS looks at, or?
Well, we'll look at the new disclosures when the rules are finalized and see if, with the presentation we present in proxy analysis, if we want to reconcile or provide them side by side, or what use we want to make with it. I think one of the things here is I think a lot of issuers were hoping this would be something akin to W-2 pay or something along those lines being used. And I think at least the proposal doesn't seem to make it appear as though the SEC was willing to go as far in sort of dumbing down the pay for performance disclosures as some issuers and their advisors had wanted them to do. But we'll see how the process plays out.
Yeah, makes sense. Then the other SEC rulemaking under Dodd-Frank that's kind of still outstanding is the CEO pay ratio disclosure. So these rules would require issuers to disclose the pay ratio, the median of the annual total compensation of all employees of the company except the CEO, compared to the annual total compensation of the CEO, and then the ratio of those two amounts. And then for that purpose, you'd calculate the CEO's and the employee's total compensation using the summary compensation table rules, basically as they are. The SEC proposed rules on that in September of 2013, so they've been out there for a while. There's some speculation that the final rules may be coming out in the fall, which could mean they would be effective as early as next year. This one probably, the SEC recently released some more kind of data and economic analysis of this proposal, so there's kind of a little bit of comment still going on, but it almost appears the SEC is kind of gearing up for potential litigation over the final rules when they come out, because I think there is a school of thought that this is going to be very burdensome to issuers potentially to calculate the median of all employees, particularly where you have international employees. Then the hedging policy disclosure rules were proposed in February of this year. And so those also could become final in time for next year. And those rules are just going to essentially require disclosure of whether you permit certain types of your insiders to engage in certain types of hedging transactions with respect to the company's stock. No official timetable for these final rules, but as I said, they could be effective in time for next year, at least in theory. And I think we are out of time, so I'll hand it back over to Ellie.
Thanks, Josh. So if you did submit a question that we didn't reply to, we will make sure to follow up with you after the program. So we do invite you to contact any of today's speakers if you have additional questions or would like more information on their particular topics, and their contact information is listed on that screen. And then this wraps up our web conference today. And just as a reminder, today's program is being recorded and will be available on Foley's website in the next few days. If you have questions regarding CLE for this program, please contact Ellie Kemeter at ekemmeter@foley.com. At the conclusion of this program, a questionnaire will appear. Please take a minute or two to give us your feedback about the presentation today. It's important for us to know your thoughts and helps to shape our programs going forward. Thank you for your participation.